what is the evidence for Luke? We begin with the Muratorian fragment. This is a fragment that dates to AD 170. It is something that was found in Rome by L.A. Muratori, an Italian man, and he was the founder, so we call it the Muratorian fragment. This fragment tells us not Matthew and Mark, it's a fragment, but it picks up after a fragmentary break with this statement here. The third book of the gospel. Well, let's think about that for a second. Matthew, Mark, and the third book of the gospel is that according to Luke. Luke, when Paul had taken him with him, composed it in his own name according to the general belief. Luke named it, even though Luke was with Paul. Yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh. He wasn't an eyewitness. And therefore, as he was able to ascertain the events, so indeed he begins to tell the story from the birth of John. Irenaeus, writing out of France, AD 180, Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Tertullian, AD 210, North Africa. Luke, however, was not an apostle, but only an apostolic man. Again, they're not squeamish about saying that Mark and Luke weren't eyewitnesses themselves, but that they themselves were under the authority of the apostles. That's where they got their historical data. He continues, not a master, but a disciple, and so inferior to a master, at least as far subsequent to him as the apostle whom he followed was subsequent to the others. Origen, writing out of Egypt in AD 250, writes, according to Luke, who wrote for those who from the Gentiles came to believe the gospel that was praised by Paul. Again, what are we seeing? Wide geographical distribution. Guys, this is before Wikipedia. This is before text messages. This is before you could call somebody, even on a rotary phone, and say, are we sure this gospel is according to Luke? Hundreds of miles away, separated culturally, and even by seas. You traveled by mule. You got messages through the Roman Empire, through mule, and so forth. And yet, all of these different authors ascribe the gospel according to Luke. Now, you could say they're all getting a common historical source. Maybe they're getting a Papias, or they're getting someone earlier. Fine with me. But what that means is that these weren't anonymous for 100 years. What this means is that these sources go back to an antecedent or previous historical source that goes back far, far earlier. I would say, why don't we just bite the bullet and say that the historical source comes from the first century church itself. I'm not saying that when Luke wrote his gospel that he wrote the gospel according to Luke at the top. I don't know that. What I'm saying is the communities to whom he gave this gospel, they knew who wrote the gospel. And the scribes who wrote, or rather copied these manuscripts, they wrote that at the top. And so I would say that the historical source is going back to the actual author himself. What about the internal evidence for Luke writing Luke? Well, I forgot to make this point. Let me begin here. Again, the same argument as Mark. Isn't it odd? Isn't it odd that you would pick the name Luke out of a hat to say Luke was the author of this gospel? Again, why not Philip, Thomas, Peter, Mary, basically anyone besides Judas would be good. Why wouldn't you say James had a gospel? You would pick a better name. Of course you would pick a better name if you were trying to give these documents a much needed authority. All right, that being said, how would we know the recipient and not know the author? Well, of course you would know the author. If the recipient is known, the author would be known as well. Or how much more would the author be known if we know the recipient? So too, we see that Luke is always mentioned with Mark. Whenever Luke is mentioned in the letters of Paul, he's always mentioned alongside of Mark. Well, what is the significance of that, you might ask? Well, Luke, in his prologue, the first 4 verses of Luke chapter 1, he says that he was using earlier testimony from the eyewitnesses, that he was flagrantly interviewing and talking to the eyewitnesses. So he was using earlier sources. Presumably that means that he was using Mark and he was using Matthew. When we read the Gospel according to Luke, 88% of the Gospel according to Mark is cited verbatim in Luke. 88% of Mark is in Luke. So roughly 90% of Mark was copied by Luke. So Luke really liked Mark's Gospel, which shows that independently they are mentioned together, spending time together with Paul in Rome, and Luke presumably was saying, Mark, let me see your biography. I want to look at it because I'm trying to write mine. So this would fit like a hand in a glove. So too, when we look at the prison letters, that is the period where Paul's in prison in Rome. At the end of the gospel, or rather at the end of the book of Acts, we see that in Acts 27 and 28, the author of Acts switches from the third person. Paul did this, Peter did that, they did this, they did that. He switches to we did this, or we did that. He switches to the first person plural. What does this mean? It means that in these three sections of the book of Acts, the author of the book joined the story. So it switches from they did this to they did that to we did this, meaning that he was there. So the author of Acts was there with Paul in Rome under house arrest. So keep that in mind over here. Over here, we read Paul's prison letters when he was under house arrest in Rome. And he mentions all sorts of people in the prison letters that are listed for you right there. He mentions all of these people. Guess who's on the list of being with Paul in Rome? So Acts says that the author was in Rome, and the prison letters list a bunch of men. Luke is mentioned right there in Rome with Paul. So I'm not saying that's an airtight argument, but I'm saying it builds the cumulative case that Luke was right where he should have been. Now, everyone agrees, whether you're a critic or a Christian, that the book of Acts is the sequel of the Gospel according to Luke. That is, whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts. So if Luke is indeed the person who wrote Acts, that means that he is the one who wrote the Gospel according to Luke.